and Media Development Foundation cordially invite you to a public lecture by one of the greatest intellectuals of our time, Professor Noam Chomsky, on September 11 and its aftermath. Where is the world heading? On Saturday, November 10th at 6 p.m. at the Music Academy, TTK Road, Chennai.
அதான் பிளான் பண்ணிருக்காங்க. ஓகே ரைட் சார். சசி இதுதான் பிளான். வாசு கெட் வாசு. Please ask them to switch off mobile.
Yeah. It is indeed a memorable occasion to have in our midst here in Chennai this evening one whom we seek out through his published work, through cyberspace, through the marginal, conscientious part of the electronic media, despite the decision of the mainstream media to by and large deny him to us. We seek him out for his searing and unsullied observation of our times, for his incisive and revealing analysis of the power mechanisms that bear down upon us, for his abiding humaneness and touching faith in the capacity and striving of the individual, the citizen, for truth and freedom. We seek him out as a corrective to the distortions that plague our lives and contemporary society. This lecture engagement, as you can well imagine, given Professor Noam Chomsky's hectic schedule, which is planned so well in advance, was fixed long before September 11th. But since we are told by the Western media that the world will never be the same again after September 11th, we were anxious to know the shape it could take hereafter. Hence the theme for Professor Chomsky this evening, September 11th and its aftermath. Where is the world heading? As is formulated by my friend, the editor of Frontline and trustee of Media Development Foundation, N. Ram. Professor Chomsky readily agreed to talk on this subject, and he will be the sole speaker this evening. On behalf of Frontline and the Media Development Foundation, a public trust in the cause of journalism, education, training, and research, and the 22 mass organizations supporting this function, I am very happy to welcome Professor Noam Chomsky and Carol Chomsky to Chennai and to this evening we have been waiting for with a lot of anticipation. I can see that the hall is bursting at the seams, and extend a very warm welcome to all of you who have turned up in such overwhelming force, even while apologizing to those not fortunate enough to have found seats in the auditorium. We have made arrangements for closed-circuit, real-time television coverage of the proceedings available on 2 monitors positioned in the foyer on the ground floor, just outside. After Professor Chomsky has made his initial presentation, he is happy to take questions from the floor. Those wishing to ask questions are requested to speak into the microphones that will be brought to you. There's one each on the ground and the floor and above, so that the rest of us can hear you, and equally important, you are also recorded Those who prefer to pose their questions in writing may please send them on to us through one of the volunteers. That's anyone with a badge who's next closest to you. Please do identify yourself so that Professor Chomsky knows whose question he's responding to. Just one or two quick announcements. I request all of you to turn off your cell phones so that we don't have that disturbing Professor Chomsky and us when we are listening to him. May I request our friends from the media fraternity, the electronic media, the television crews, to try and restrict their coverage in terms of movement in the hall to the first few minutes, and then settle down so that we do not disturb others who may like to see and hear what's happening. With these few words, and apologizing again for the inconvenience to those who are not able to find a seat in the auditorium, I request N. Editor Frontline, and Founder Trustee Media Development Foundation to formally introduce Professor Noam Chomsky.
Noam Chomsky, Institute Professor at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, is the great polymath of our age. Although given his own attitude to heroes and hype, I'm sure he will dissent from such characterizations. Renowned scholar, founder of the modern science of linguistics, philosopher, social theorist, political analyst, media critic, author of many books, winner of many prizes and awards, Professor Chomsky has been described by an intellectual biographer as having, and I quote, a position in the history of ideas on a par with Darwin or Descartes. The New York Times once described him as arguably the most important intellectual alive, although Noam always reminds us, read the next sentence. They usually say, why does he do such terrible things, say such terrible things about American foreign policy? But the New York Times nevertheless described him once as arguably the most important intellectual alive, and on another occasion as perhaps the clearest voice of dissent in American history. Professor Chomsky is reported in recent surveys to be the most cited of living authors. Raising the question, why is Chomsky important? Neil Smith, a linguistic theorist and author of an insightful and accessible book on his ideas and ideals, provides the following answer. Professor Chomsky has revolutionized linguistics by showing that there is only one human language and that the immense complexity of the world's languages must be, quote, variations on a single theme. This theorizing has profound philosophical implications. By resurrecting the theory of innate ideas, Professor Chomsky has demonstrated that a substantial part of our knowledge is genetically determined. Reinstating rationalist ideas that go back centuries, he has provided evidence that unconscious knowledge is what underlies humankind's ability to speak and understand. Further, overturning the dominant school of behaviorism in psychology, he has, quote, returned the mind to its position of preeminence in the study of humankind, end quote. In short, Professor Chomsky has changed the way we think of ourselves. But this is by no means all. Points out Neil Smith, he has done this while devoting a great deal of his time to political and social analysis and activism. And to quote this author, documenting the lies of government, exposing the hidden influences of big business, developing a model of the social order, and acting as the conscience of the West, end quote. This mild-mannered professor is the polymath's great dissenter. His work in every field he has entered has been described as an unrelenting refusal to follow the herd, with his dissent being no obstinate rejectionism, but a deeply worked out position, which, depending on the field, offers a several analyses, including what Smith calls the centrality of explanation. Noam's political outlook and the specific positions he has taken over the decades on central issues that matter to millions of people and mark and define the period, these are celebrated or notorious, depending on which side of the fence you are on. He was one of the first among American intellectuals to take a clear and uncompromising stand against the Vietnam War. In an influential and widely admired essay on the responsibility of intellectuals, which appeared in the New York Review of Books in February of 1967 and enraged the US establishment, Professor Chomsky examined the positions and arguments of a range of American intellectuals from Walt Rostow through Arthur Schlesinger, Herman Kahn, and Irving Kristol to no less than Henry Kissinger, vis-a-vis the United States war of aggression and butchery against Vietnam. At a broader level, Noam has looked at the role of leading American intellectuals in the construction of pro-imperialist ideologies and propaganda, the justification of the use of force to impose US writ on the rest of the world, especially the Third World. He spotlighted the unsqueamish equanimity with which some well-known American intellectuals countenanced, recommended, or endorsed such methods as mass starvation, intensive bombing, and the extinguishing of national sovereignty. In his 1967 essay, which marked, I think, a watershed in the development of the opposition to the Vietnam War, Professor Chomsky offered a clear and powerful formulation that cut through hypocrisy, cant, and confusion in order to emphasize the great intellectual and moral imperative of truth-telling and activism in its behalf. And to quote from that celebrated essay, intellectuals are in a position to expose the lies of government, to analyze actions according to their causes and motives, and often hidden intentions. In the Western world, at least, they have the power that comes from political liberty, from access to information and freedom of expression. For a privileged minority, Western democracy provides the leisure, the facilities, and the training to seek the truth lying hidden behind the veil of distortion and misrepresentation, ideology, and class interest through which the events of current history are presented to us. And then he went on to say, it is a responsibility of intellectuals to speak the truth and to expose lies. It's also their duty to see events in their historical perspective. Noam is also the great exemplar of an intellectual being able to integrate theory with practice. He has had no hesitation in putting his dazzling academic career on the line for the sake of the intellectual, political, and moral principles he has espoused. He has spent time in jail for his role in the demonstrations against the Vietnam War. Asked once why he took such risks, he replied in one of the books available on him, and I quote, "It has to do with being able to look yourself in the eye in the morning." As is well known, Noam has invested a great deal of his intellectual time on researching and analyzing US international or foreign policy. He is best known in the public sphere for this magnificent contribution, unmatched in our time by any other academic or intellectual to the best of my knowledge. While Noam's concerns are truly universal, he has paid particular attention to 4 areas: Southeast Asia, above all Vietnam, Central and South America, Israel, the Palestinian liberation struggle, and West Asia, and East Timor, where the Indonesian military dictatorship committed genocide with US connivance and military support. We can add to this his clear and powerful analysis of the character and effects of the Gulf War and consequent US military actions and atrocities against Iraqi civilians, including children. Since 1991, Frontline, the magazine I edit, has had the privilege of publishing several interviews with Noam on this subject, with my friend Dr. V.K. Ramachandran doing most of the interviews. As a journalist, as an Indian journalist, I'd like publicly to thank Noam for this extraordinary generosity with his time. Not surprisingly, about September 11, 2001 and its aftermath, which has ushered in an international crisis, he has had a great deal to say. By addressing the essential questions and focusing on concerns that are sought to be marginalized, he has provided a clear analytical framework for understanding and acting on the current international crisis. A word on his method. A self-avowed believer in Cartesian common sense, the scientific method laid out by Descartes, Professor Chomsky applies the following methodological rules in thinking logically towards reliable conclusions. And to quote from a primer on Chomsky, and I hope that's a reliable sum up of his methods: accept only clear and distinct ideas, Break each problem into as many parts as necessary to solve it. Work from the simple to the complex. Always check for mistakes. Absolutely vital in journalism. His typical analytic technique has been described as the classic academician's accumulation of massive documentation, relying both on standard references and on sources that are frequently ignored by mainstream commentators and historians, with a method flavored by use of irony. Noam is also the rarest of intellectuals, and we are witness to that today, one with a fan following across the globe. The last time he was in India was in January of 1996. As many of you are aware, since he's in great demand as a public speaker in many parts of the world, his time needs to be literally, and I don't exaggerate a bit, booked years in advance. I have over the past few days received calls from Pondicherry, Bangalore, Hyderabad, and even Tunisia, imploring me to use my good offices to persuade Professor Chomsky to make just this slight detour during the current visit to give lectures in these places. And the last time he came to India, no public engagement was scheduled in Chennai, although I learned last night from Noam that he passed through Chennai and was hijacked for something like an all-night discussion on linguistics. That is in 1996. This public lecture is a result of the booking we made soon after the last visit. The program and schedule of this visit were of course drawn up, as Sashi mentioned, much before September 11 happened. Nevertheless, the distinguished lecturer readily agreed to speak about the present international crisis and what must be done about it, accepting the title we proposed. This is a major theme he's taking up in his public engagements in India, but elsewhere he has also covered other issues relating to linguistics, militarism, democracy, and the people's right to know, and also globalization. This morning, we had a wonderful intellectual treat. Noam in a 2-hour open and free discussion at our Asian College of Journalism, administered by the Media Development Foundation, of which Sashi Kumar is the chairman. Many issues were covered, from Afghanistan to linguistics, and students got priority in asking the questions. In our original plan for this public lecture, we had doubts whether we could factor in any time for questions. But when he mentioned this to Professor Chomsky, he clearly preferred to take questions following the lecture. That is his choice, despite certain problems, space constraints and other problems. We think we can take something like 30 minutes for that. It is a special pleasure to be able to welcome Carol Chomsky, a scholar who has made a contribution to language and linguistics in her own right. Already over the past 8 hours, Sashi and I have collaborated sincerely with Carol to protect Noam's vocal cords against the relentless demands made against them. The musicians present here, including the distinguished president of the Music Academy, my friend Mr. T.T. Vasu, will especially appreciate the importance of this. Friends, I have the honor of presenting to you
Okay.
The traditional South Indian welcome.
Oh. Well, what's going to make it stay on? Yeah, okay. Okay. This is going to fall in 1 minute, so I might as well take it over. Thank you. A few years ago, one of the great figures of contemporary biology, Ernst Mayr of Harvard, published some reflections on the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. His conclusion was that the likelihood of success was effectively zero. His reasoning had to do with the adaptive value of what we call higher intelligence, meaning the particular form of, the particular human form of intellectual organization. Mayr estimates the number of species since the origin of life at about 50 billion, only one of which, he writes, achieved the kind of intelligence needed to establish a civilization. It did so very recently, perhaps 100,000 years ago, in a small breeding group of which we are all survivors. And he speculates that this form of intellectual organization may not be favored by selection, and points out that life on Earth refutes the claim that it's better to be smart than stupid, at least judging by biological success, which is great for beetles and bacteria, but not so good as you move higher up the level of cognitive organization. And he also makes the rather somber observation that the average life expectancy of a species is about 100,000 years. We're entering a period of human life that may provide an answer to the question of whether it's better to be smart than stupid. The most hopeful prospect is that the question will not be answered. If it receives a definite answer, that answer can only be that humans were a kind of biological error, using their allotted 100,000 years to destroy themselves and, in the process, much else. The species has certainly developed the capacity to do just that, and an extraterrestrial observer, if one could exist, might conclude that they have demonstrated that capacity throughout their history, dramatically in the past several hundred years, with an assault on the environment that sustains life, on the diversity of more complex organisms, and with cold and calculated savagery on each other as well. September 11th and the aftermath are a case in point. The shocking atrocities of September 11th are widely regarded as a historic event, and that, I think, is most definitely true, but we should think clearly about exactly why it's true. These crimes had the most, perhaps the most devastating instant human toll on record outside of war, but the word instant should not be overlooked. It's unfortunate but true that the crime is far from unusual in the annals of violence that falls short of war. The aftermath of September 11th is only one of innumerable illustrations of that. Although the scale of the catastrophe that has already taken place in Afghanistan can only be guessed, and we can hardly speculate about what may follow, we do know the projections on which policy decisions are based. And from these we can gain some insight into the question of where the world is heading. The answer, unfortunately, is that it's heading in directions that are well traveled, though there certainly are changes. The crimes of September 11th are indeed a historic turning point, but not because of their scale, rather because of the choice of target. For the United States, this is the first time since the British burned down Washington in 1814 that the national territory has been under attack, or for that matter, even under threat. And I don't have to review what's happened in those 2 centuries. The number of victims is huge. Now, for the first time, the guns have been pointed in the opposite direction, and that's a dramatic change. The same is true even more dramatically of Europe. Europe has suffered murderous destruction, but that's Europeans slaughtering one another. Meanwhile, Europeans conquered much of the world, not very politely. With rare and limited exceptions, they were not under attack by their foreign victims. So it is not surprising that Europe should be utterly shocked by the terrorist crimes of September 11th. And while September 11th is indeed a dramatic change in world affairs, the aftermath represents no change at all, and therefore passes with very little notice. Well, all of this raises questions that should be considered with some care if we hope to avert still further tragedies. And lurking not very far in the shadows is the question that I already mentioned. Is the species on the verge of demonstrating that higher intelligence is simply a grotesque biological error? Some of these questions have to do with immediate events, some with more lasting and fundamental issues. And among the questions that come to mind are these. First of all, and most critically important, what's happening right before our eyes? Secondly, a bit more general, what is the new war on terrorism? Thirdly, what about the tendencies that are already underway? And there are several I'd like to mention at least. One is the rapid increase in the means of mass destruction. Second is the threats to the environment that sustains human life. And third is the shaping of international society by the world's dominant power centers, state and private, what's misleadingly called globalization. And throughout, we should ask quite seriously, I think, to what extent ominous tendencies that are all too easy to perceive reflect choices that are natural and in fact even rational within existing institutional and ideological structures. To the extent that they do, that's the greatest danger of all. Well, let's begin briefly at least with the first and most immediate question. What's happening before our eyes? And what do we learn about it from where the world is heading under the leadership of its most powerful forces? Even before September 11th, much of the population of Afghanistan was relying on international food aid for survival. Current estimates by the United Nations and others in a position to know are not seriously challenged. The estimates are that the number at risk since September 11th as a direct consequence of the threat of bombing, then the attack itself, has risen by about 2.5 million, by 50%, to approximately 7.5 million. Pleas to stop the bombing, to allow delivery of desperately needed food, have been rebuffed virtually without comment. These have come from high UN officials, from charitable agencies, and others. The UN Food and Agriculture Organization had already warned, even before the bombing, that over 7 million people would face starvation if military action was initiated. And after the bombing began, it advised that the threat of a humanitarian catastrophe in the short term was very grave, and furthermore that the bombing had disrupted the planting of 80% of the country's grain supplies, so that the effects next year will be even more severe. Actually, what the effects will be, we will never know. Starvation is not something that kills people instantly. People eat roots and leaves, and they drag on for a while. And the effects of starvation may be the death of children born from malnourished mothers a year or two from now, and all sorts of consequences. And furthermore, nobody's going to look, because the West is not interested in such things and others don't have the resources. There are plenty of examples of that. So August 1998, Clinton bombed the Sudan, destroyed half of its pharmaceutical supplies and the factory that produced them. The consequences of that are unknown. The few attempts to estimate the toll, the death toll, are in the neighborhood of tens of thousands of people by the German embassy in Sudan, by a few independent investigators who've looked. Actually, nobody really looked carefully because nobody cares. It's not important, it's normal, it's ordinary for a couple of bombs to have the effect of leaving tens of thousands of corpses in a poor African country. And this is something comparable, though probably on a considerably greater scale, is unfolding right in front of us at this moment. Well, what the consequences will be, we do not know, and probably never will know in any detail. But what we do know is that these are the expectations on which Western civilization is relying as it lays its plans. And only those who are entirely ignorant of modern history will be surprised by the course of events or by the justifications that are provided by the educated classes. These are important topics that I'll reluctantly put aside for lack of time. I might say that the combination of sadistic cruelty and starry-eyed self-adulation is captured, well, to give one example, it's captured accurately enough by the American press just about 100 years ago during the noble campaign to uplift and Christianize the Philippines, as the president described it. They succeeded in uplifting about 500,000 Filipinos within the next few years, along with slaughtering them, along with horrifying war crimes carried out by old Indian fighters who were killing the niggers, as they put it. That finally aroused some disquiet at home, and the press explained that it takes patience to overcome evil, that it will be a long war, and that we will have to slaughter the natives in English fashion until the misguided creatures who resist us will at least come to respect our arms, and later will come to understand that we wish them nothing but happiness and freedom, as in Afghanistan today and all too many other places for hundreds of years. Well, it's much too brief, but let me put that terrifying issue aside and turn to the second question. What is the new war on terrorism? The goal of the civilized world has been announced very clearly in high places. We must, quoting, eradicate the evil scourge of terrorism, a plague spread by depraved opponents of civilization itself, in a return to barbarism in the modern age, and so on. Surely a noble enterprise. To place the enterprise in proper perspective, we should recognize that the crusade is not new, contrary to what's being said. In fact, the phrases I just quoted are from President Ronald Reagan and his Secretary of State, George Shultz, 20 years ago. They came to office at that time, Reagan shortly after Shultz, proclaiming that the struggle against international terrorism would be the core of U.S. foreign policy. And they responded to the plague by organizing campaigns of international terrorism of unprecedented scale and violence, even leading to a condemnation by the World Court of the United States for what the court called the unlawful use of force, meaning international terrorism, followed by a Security Council resolution calling on all states to observe international law, which the United States vetoed, also voting alone with one or two client states against successive General Assembly resolutions. So the new war on terrorism is in fact led by the only state in the world which has been condemned by the International Court of Justice for international terrorism, and has vetoed a resolution calling on states to observe international law, which is perhaps appropriate. The World Court order to terminate the crime of international terrorism and to pay substantial reparations was dismissed with contempt across the spectrum. The New York Times, my friends who were just quoted, informed the public that the court was a hostile forum and therefore we need pay no attention to it. Washington reacted at once to the court orders by escalating the economic and the terrorist wars. It also issued official orders to the mercenary army attacking from Honduras to attack what are called soft targets. Those are the official orders, attack soft targets. That means undefended civilian targets like health clinics and agricultural cooperatives and so on, and to avoid combat, as the Army could do thanks to total U.S. control of the skies and the sophisticated communications equipment that was provided to the terrorist forces attacking from foreign bases. These orders aroused a little discussion, not much, and they were considered legitimate, but only with qualifications, only if pragmatic criteria were satisfied. So one prominent commentator, who was regarded as the spokesperson of the left in mainstream discussion, happened to be writing in the Wall Street Journal this time, he argued that we should not simply dismiss State Department justifications for terrorist attacks on soft targets. He wrote that a sensible policy must meet the test of cost-benefit analysis. these are all quotes, that is an analysis of the amount of blood and misery that will be poured in and the likelihood that democracy will emerge at the other end. Democracy means what Western elites decide is democracy. And that interpretation was illustrated quite clearly in the region at the time. It's taken for granted that Western elites have the right to conduct the analysis and pursue the project if it passes their tests. And pass their tests it did. When Nicaragua, the target, finally succumbed to superpower assault, commentators across the spectrum of respectable opinion lauded the success, I'm quoting, the success of the methods adopted to wreck the economy and prosecute a long and deadly proxy war until the exhausted natives overthrow the unwanted government themselves with a cost to us that is minimal, leaving the victims with wrecked bridges, sabotaged power stations, and ruined farms, and tens of thousands of corpses, which are not mentioned, and thus providing the U.S. candidate with a winning issue, ending the impoverishment of the people of Nicaragua. That happens to be Time magazine, but it was pretty characteristic. We are united in joy at this outcome, the New York Times proclaimed, proud of the victory for U.S. fair play, as a Times headline read. We're united in joy again, just a few days ago, as the U.S. candidate in the Nicaraguan election. The U.S. candidate won the Nicaraguan election after very stern warnings by Washington of the consequences if the Nicaraguan people did not understand their responsibilities. The Washington Post, other national newspaper, explained the victory cheerfully. The U.S. candidate, I'm quoting, focused the campaign on reminding people of the economic and military difficulties of the Sandinista era, referring to the U.S. terrorist war and economic strangulation that destroyed the country. Meanwhile, leering George Bush peers at us from television, instructing us that the one universal law is that all variants of terror and murder are evil, unless, of course, we are the agents, in which case terror and murder lead us to what's called a noble phase of our foreign policy with a saintly glow, so the newspaper of record informs us. There's nothing particular new about this. This goes back hundreds of years, and you can find examples among the hegemonic powers consistently. Prevailing Western attitudes are revealed with great clarity by the reaction to the appointment of a new UN ambassador to lead the war, today's war against terrorism. It's John Negroponte. Negroponte's record includes his service as proconsul in Honduras in the 1980s, where he was the local supervisor of the international terrorist war, for which his government was condemned by the World Court and the Security Council, irrelevantly, of course, in a world that's governed by the rule of force. There was no detectable reaction to that, either in the United States or in Europe. Another of Negroponte's condemned colleagues was just here. He was here for a few hours, gave him enough time to declare that we will crush terror, was the headline for an enthusiastic front page article in the national press here a few days ago. I think even Jonathan Swift would be speechless of all of this. I mention the case of Nicaragua not because it's the most extreme example of international terrorism, unfortunately far from it, but because it's uncontroversial, given the judgments of the highest international authorities. Uncontroversial, that is, among people who have a minimal commitment to human rights and international law. And one can estimate the size of that category by determining how often these elementary matters have been mentioned in the period since September 11th, and from that, don't bother carrying out an extensive inquiry, you'll find approximately zero. And from that exercise alone, you can draw some grim conclusions about what lies ahead. Well, during the first war on terrorism, the Reagan years, U.S.-sponsored state terrorism in Central America left hundreds of thousands of tortured and mutilated corpses, millions of maimed and orphaned, 4 countries in ruins. Also in the same years, the Reagan years, Western-backed South African depredations killed about 1.5 million people and caused $60 billion of damage in the South African depredations backed by the United States and Britain and others. I don't have to speak of West and Southeast Asia, South America, or much else. It's a serious analytic error without proceeding to describe terrorism as a weapon of the weak, as is often done. That's simply not the case. Very radically not the case. There's a great deal more to say about terrorism, the terrorism of the weak against the powerful, and the unmentionable but far more extreme terrorism of the powerful against the weak. That both pose severe threats is hardly in doubt. The threats are enhanced by the fact that the policies are considered rational within the frameworks in which they are pursued. And there's reason for that. One major historian, Charles Tilley, who studied the history of these issues in Europe particularly, he observed quite accurately that over the last millennium, war has been the dominant activity of European states. And the reason, he says, is the central tragic fact, which is simple: coercion works. Those who apply substantial force to their fellows get compliance, and from that compliance draw the multiple advantages of money, goods, deference, access to pleasures denied to less powerful people. It's a truism understood all too well by most of the people of the world, even if it hasn't penetrated the heights of intellectual enlightenment. Well, let me turn to the third category of questions: long-term tendencies that are underway and that will persist without essential change, though there's a change there too. They're being escalated as state and private power exploit the window of opportunity that's provided by the fear and anguish of the population, and naturally use that opportunity to ram through harsh and regressive measures that would otherwise arouse resistance. As usual, one participant in class war pursues its task with unrelenting intensity. It's their victims who are enjoined to be subdued and acquiescent in the interests of patriotism. The range of measures being implemented in this fashion is far-ranging. I'll mention only a few. The most important of them is the instant escalation of the policies that pose the greatest immediate threat to survival, namely expanding the means of mass destruction. For the powerful, nuclear weapons are the weapon of choice. The U.S. Strategic Command, the highest authority, military authority, it describes nuclear weapons as the core of the arsenal, I'm quoting now, because unlike chemical or biological weapons, the extreme destruction from a nuclear explosion is immediate, with few, if any, palliatives to reduce its effect. And nuclear weapons always cast a shadow over any crisis or conflict. This study advises further that planners should not portray ourselves as too fully rational or cool-headed, that the United States may become irrational and vindictive if its vital interests are attacked should be part of the national persona that we project. It's beneficial for our strategic posture if some elements appear to be potentially out of control. Those are all quotes. The United States is unusual, I think unique, in the access that it allows to high-level planning documents. And I'd be rather surprised if those of other countries were fundamentally different. The important study that I've just been quoting from is called Essentials of Post-Cold War Deterrence, It's a Clinton-era document. It's been available for years, but it's unknown. It's known only to readers of dissident literature that's scrupulously marginalized, although I presume intelligence services of other countries read it and draw the appropriate conclusions. For the future, we also have to face the fact that small nuclear weapons can be smuggled into any country with relative ease. And remember, they are small, a 15-pound, 15 kiloton, no, 15 pound, I guess. A 15-pound plutonium bomb can be carried across a border in a suitcase. There's a recent technical study that concludes that a well-planned operation to smuggle weapons of mass destruction into the United States would have at least a 90% probability of success, much higher than ICBM delivery, even in the absence of national missile defense. These dangers, not just to the United States, are enhanced by the most immediate threat that was identified by a high-level U.S. Department of Energy task force, namely, I'm quoting them, 40,000 nuclear weapons in the former Soviet Union, poorly controlled and poorly stored. One of the first acts of the incoming Bush administration was to cut back a small program to assist Russia in safeguarding and dismantling these weapons and providing alternative employment for nuclear scientists. That decision increased the risks of accidental launch and leakage of what are called loose nukes, followed by nuclear scientists who have no other way to employ their skills. Current plans for ballistic missile defense are expected to enhance the threats further. U.S. intelligence predicts that any deployment will impel China to develop and deploy new nuclear-armed missiles. They predict it'll expand its nuclear arsenal by a factor of 10, probably with multiple warheads, MIRV, which will prompt India and Pakistan to respond with their own buildups, with a likely ripple effect throughout the Middle East. These same analyses, intelligence analyses and others, also conclude that Russia's only rational response would be to maintain and strengthen the existing Russian nuclear force. The Bush administration announced on September 1st of this year that it has no objections to China's plans to build up its small fleet of nuclear missiles. That's a sharp shift in official policy in the hope of gaining Chinese acquiescence to the planned dismantling of the core arms control agreements. Chinese resumption of nuclear tests is also being quietly endorsed. On the same day that this was announced, the national press also reported that the Bush administration will impose sanctions on China for allowing the transfer to Pakistan of missile parts and technology that are essentially for weapons that can carry nuclear warheads, all quoted from the New York Times. You can figure out what all of that means without further comment. Extension of the arms race to space has been a core program for quite a few years. Arms race is a misleading term for it. The United States, for now at least, is competing alone in this race, although there are others who appear to be eager to join the race to mutual destruction. Rightly or wrongly, that's how India's stand is being interpreted in the United States. That received great applause from the more hawkish and jingoist U.S. strategic analyses. Writing after the foreign minister's visit to the United States a few months ago. Lawrence Kaplan wrote in the liberal New Republic that when President Bush unveiled his plans to expand these programs, the rest of the world carped that the plan would provoke a new arms race, but India took a mere 6 hours to declare its support, while Foreign Minister Singh boasted that New Delhi and Washington are endeavoring to work out together a totally new security regime, which is for the entire globe. Whether that's the right interpretation or not, you can determine, but that is the interpretation. Kaplan went on to quote administration hawks who recognize that Pakistan is not an ally anymore, but rather a rogue state, unlike India, which will now be admitted into the club that includes the United States, Britain, Taiwan, and Israel. It's true that this was 3 months ago, and since then all of us have observed a small lesson in Axiom 1 of international affairs. States are not moral agents. Their solemn pledges mean exactly zero. They serve domestic power interests, and they do as they please, unless they're constrained externally or by their own citizens, a choice that lies in our hands, at least in the more free and democratic societies. Well, all of these programs increase the danger of destruction for the United States as for others, but that's nothing new. It's very common to pursue programs that consciously, with the conscious knowledge that they increase the danger of destruction for the participants, the advocates. The history of the Cold War, the arms race during the Cold War, that provides many examples, and there's ample precedents going back far in history. And furthermore, all these choices make sense within the prevailing value system. Both of these topics bear quite directly on the assessment of the biological success of higher intelligence. So just look at a couple of cases. 50 years ago, there was only one major threat to U.S. security, at that time only potential. That was ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, which did not yet then exist, but were being developed. It was quite likely that the Soviet Union would have accepted a treaty banning development of these weapons, knowing that it was far behind. There is a standard history of the arms race by McGeorge Bundy, the National Security Advisor for the Kennedy and Johnson administrations. He had access to internal documents. He reported that he could find no record of any interest in pursuing the possibility of eliminating the sole potential threat to U.S. security. Recently, Russian archives, quite a lot of them have been released recently, and these bear on this question. They strongly reinforce the assessments by high-level U.S. analysts that after Stalin's death, Khrushchev, when he took over, called for mutual reduction of offensive military forces. And when these initiatives were ignored by the Eisenhower administration, he implemented them unilaterally over the objection of his own military command. Kennedy's planners, when they came in 40 years ago, they doubtless shared Eisenhower's understanding that, in his words, a major war would destroy the Northern Hemisphere. And they also knew, we now know, they knew of Khrushchev's unilateral steps to reduce Soviet offensive forces radically, and they also knew that the United States was far ahead by any meaningful measure. Nevertheless, they chose to reject Khrushchev's plea for reciprocity, preferring to carry out a massive conventional and nuclear force buildup, thus driving the last nail into the coffin of Khrushchev's agenda of restraining the Soviet military. It's quoting historian Michael Evangelista, who's reviewing the U.S. and Soviet archival records in the main history project on this topic. Without continuing, there's not much novelty in the Clinton-Bush preferences. To comprehend the logic of these programs and why mutual destruction seems entirely rational policy to pursue, to understand that, it's necessary to recall a doctrinal truism. It's conventional for attack to be called defense, and this case is no exception. Ballistic missile defense is only a small component of much more far-reaching programs for militarization of space. The goal is to achieve what is called full spectrum dominance, that is, a monopoly of the use of space for offensive military purposes. These plans have been available in public documents of the U.S. Space Command and other government agencies for some years, and the projects outlined have been under development. They were expanded in the first months of the Bush administration and again sharply expanded after September 11th in a crude exploitation of the fear and horror that was engendered by these crimes. The plans are disguised as ballistic missile defense, but that's only a small component of what's under development, and even that small component is an offensive weapon. That's understood by such potential adversaries as Russia and China, and also by close allies. China's top arms control official simply reflected common understanding when he observed that once the United States believes it has both a strong spear and a strong shield, it could lead them to conclude that nobody can harm the United States and they can harm anyone they like anywhere in the world. China's position is shared by high-level U.S. strategic analysts in virtually the same words. Rand Corporation is the main major, mostly military research agency. A Rand Corporation study of the topic concluded that ballistic missile defense is not simply a shield, but rather an enabler of U.S. action. Same words as China. Canada's military planners advised their government that the goal of ballistic missile defense is arguably more in order to preserve U.S. NATO freedom of action than because the U.S. really fears North Korean or Iranian threats. Quote another leading strategic analyst, Andrew Basevich, ballistic missile defense will facilitate the more effective application of U.S. military power abroad. Happens to be writing in the conservative journal National Interest. He says, by insulating the homeland from reprisal, missile defense will underwrite the capacity and willingness of the United States to shape the environment elsewhere. He cites approvingly the conclusions of Lawrence Kaplan, who happens to be writing at the other end of the spectrum. He says, missile defense isn't really meant to protect America. It's a tool for global dominance, for hegemony. It's understood that missile defense, even if it's technically feasible, has to rely on satellite communication. And destroying satellites is far easier than shooting down missiles. That's one reason why the United States must seek full spectrum dominance, such overwhelming control of space that even the poor man's weapons will not be available to an adversary. And that requires offensive space-based capacities. That includes immensely destructive weapons, nuclear-powered in space, that can be launched with instant computer-controlled reaction. That greatly increases the danger of vast slaughter and devastation, if only because of what are called in the trade normal accidents. That is, the unpredictable accidents to which all complex systems are subject. The goals of the logic of militarization of space is much broader, however, and it's explained. The U.S. Space Command, the major agency in charge, has been quite explicit about this. It put out an important brochure in the Clinton years, 1997, called A Vision for the Year 2020. And in it, it announced the primary goal quite prominently on the front cover in big letters, dominating the space dimension of military operations to protect U.S. interests and investment. This is presented as the next phase of the historic task of military forces. They say that armies were needed during the westward expansion of the continental United States, of course in self-defense, against the indigenous population that was being exterminated and expelled. Nations also built navies, the Space Command continues, to protect and enhance their commercial interests. And the next logical step is space forces to protect military and commercial interests and investments. However, they say the United States Space Forces will be unlike navies protecting sea commerce in earlier years, because this time there will be a sole hegemon. The British Navy could be countered by Germany with consequences that we need not discuss, but the U.S. somehow will remain immune, except to the narrowly circumscribed category of terrorism that is permitted to enter the canon, the terrorism that they carry out against us whoever we happen to be. The need for total dominance, they argue, is going to increase as a result of the globalization of the economy. The reason is that globalization is expected to bring about a widening between haves and have-nots, which is an assessment shared by U.S. intelligence and academic analysts. Come back to that. Planners are concerned that the widening divide may lead to unrest among the have-nots, and the U.S. must be ready to control that by using space systems and planning for precision strike from space as a counter to worldwide proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, a predictable consequence of the recommended programs, as I just mentioned, just as the widening divide is an anticipated consequence of the preferred form of globalization. Notice that happens to be in conflict with the economic theories that are professed, but it's in accord with reality. Well, again, there's more to say about that, but I'm keeping my eye on the clock. Throughout history, it has been recognized that such steps are dangerous. I gave some few examples, but there are many more. By now, the danger has reached the level of a threat to human survival. But there's a good reason to pursue it nevertheless. It's deeply rooted in existing institutions. The basic principle is that hegemony is more important than survival. That's not new. Plenty of examples through history. The principles amply illustrated in the last half century. What's new is the scale of the consequences of pursuing this principle. Well, let's turn to another apparently inexorable tendency, the destruction of the environment that sustains human life. The Bush administration has been widely criticized for undermining the Kyoto Treaty. The grounds that they presented were that would, to conform to the treaty, would harm the U.S. economy. And those criticisms are rather surprising because the decisions are entirely rational within the framework of existing ideology. We're instructed daily to be firm believers in what are called neoclassical markets, in which isolated individuals are rational wealth maximizers. The market responds perfectly to their votes, which are expressed in currency inputs. The value of a person's interests are measured the same way. In particular, the interests of those with no votes, no dollars, those interests are valued at zero. Future generations, for example, who don't have dollar inputs in the market. So it's therefore entirely rational to destroy the possibility for decent survival for our grandchildren if by doing so we can maximize the particular form of self-interest that's hailed as the highest value, reinforced by vast industries that are devoted to implanting and reinforcing them. The threats to survival are currently being enhanced by dedicated efforts to weaken the institutional structures that have been developed to mitigate the harsh consequences of market fundamentalism, and even more important, to undermine the culture of sympathy and solidarity that sustains these institutions. Well, that's another prescription for disaster, perhaps in the not very distant future, but again, it's rational within a lunatic system of doctrines and institutions. Let me finally turn to the last of the questions that I mentioned, the process that's called globalization. But first, let's be clear about the notion. If we use the term neutrally, globalization just means international integration, welcome or not, depending on the human consequences. In Western doctrinal systems, which prevail everywhere as a result of Western power, the term has a somewhat different meaning, a narrower meaning. It refers to a specific form of international integration, which has been pursued with particular intensity in the last quarter century. It's designed primarily in the interests of private concentrations of power, and the interests of everyone else are incidental. With that terminology in place, the great mass of people around the world who object to these programs can be labeled anti-globalization, as they always are. and the force of ideology and power is such that they even accept that ridiculous designation. They can then be derided as primitivists who want to return to the Stone Age to harm the poor and other terms of abuse with which we're familiar. It's a way you'd expect a dedicated propaganda system to work. What's a little surprising is that it's so powerful that even its victims accept it. We shouldn't. The specific form, no sane person is opposed to globalization. The question is what form it takes. The specific form of international integration that's being pursued is called neoliberal, but that too is highly misleading. The policies are not new, and they're by no means liberal. That should be particularly obvious here. The history of England and India for 2 centuries illustrates very graphically how liberalism can be shaped into an instrument of power and destruction. And the current version, it keeps the tradition, it maintains the traditional double-edged doctrine of free trade and liberalism, fine for you so that I can demolish you, but I'm going to insist on the protection of the powerful nanny state and other devices to ensure that I'm not subject to market discipline, except when the playing field is what is called level. That means tilted so sharply in my favor that I'm confident that I can win. That's a good part of the history of India for a couple hundred years. The fact that the new versions simply adapt the traditional ones to current circumstances, that shouldn't come as a surprise. It's exactly what we would expect, simply by a look at the designers. The richest and most powerful states, the international financial institutions that follow their directives, and an array of megacorporations tending towards oligopoly in most sectors of the economy and heavily reliant on the state sector to socialize risk and cost and to maintain the dynamism of the economy, often under a military cover. These power concentrations often modestly call themselves the international community, but perhaps a more appropriate term is one that's used by the business press. Last January at the annual Davos conference, they were described by the London Financial Times as the masters of the universe. Since the masters profess to be admirers of Adam Smith, we might expect them to abide by his description of their behavior, although he only called them the masters of mankind. But after all, that was before the space age. Smith was referring specifically to what he called the principal architects of policy of his day, the merchants and manufacturers of England, who made sure that their own interests are most peculiarly attended to, however grievous the impact on others, including the people of England. And I'm sure you know he condemned with particular vehemence the crimes of England and India in his day. The principal architects, he wrote, adopt the vile maxim of the masters of mankind, all for ourselves and nothing for anyone else. And that persists. Over time, in developments that surely would have appalled the founders of classical liberalism, corporate management has been granted the rights of immortal persons by radical judicial activism, and it's been granted rights that go far beyond those of mere persons in international economic agreements. So, for example, General Motors can demand national treatment in Mexico, but a Mexican of flesh and blood would not fare too well if he were to demand such treatment after crossing the border to Texas, assuming that he made it alive. Many don't. The rights of these private tyrannies, which is what they are, these are being extended in current trade agreements which allow private power concentrations to attack government regulations concerning health, environmental protection, workers' rights, and so on the grounds that these are tantamount to expropriation because they threaten future profits. In a further assault on classical liberal principles, these enormous systems of unaccountable private power assume the role of administering markets. That includes intra-firm transfers across borders within a particular corporate entity, outsourcing strategic alliances, and a whole range of other devices to evade market discipline, and that in fact constitute the majority of what is mislabeled trade. When you hear that trade is going up, the fact of the matter is that in classical terms it's probably going down. These policies and their human consequences have been matters of great concern outside the ranks of the masters of the universe. There have been large-scale popular protests in the South against the new international economic regime for many years. They're harder to ignore when the rich countries join in, as they have in the past few years. In the United States, despite near unanimous articulate support for free trade agreements, or as the Wall Street Journal calls them more honestly, free investment agreements, the population has remained stubbornly opposed. That's why NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement, had to be imposed effectively in secret 10 years ago. And to this day, the official position of the labor movement has not been permitted expression in the free press, or even the very similar proposals and critique of Congress's own research bureau. It's extremely important to keep the public from knowing that its opposition to these treaties is well-grounded in very respectable analysis. One might ask why public opposition to globalization, what's called globalization, has been so high for many years. That seems strange in an era when globalization has led to unprecedented prosperity, so we're constantly told. And that's supposedly particularly true in the United States with its fairy tale economy. Throughout the 1990s, the United States enjoyed the greatest economic boom in America's history, in fact, in the world's history. Quoting Anthony Lewis in the New York Times last March, repeating the standard refrain from the left end, the critical end of the admissible spectrum. It is, of course, conceded that everything isn't perfect. There are a few flaws. Some have been left behind in the economic miracle, and since we're good-hearted people, we have to do something about that. These flaws reflect a profound and troubling dilemma. The rapid growth and great prosperity brought by globalization has a concomitant growing inequality because there are some who lack the skills to enjoy these wondrous gifts and opportunities. That picture is so conventional that it may be hard to realize that apart from the growing inequality, it is totally false. There's just no truth to it, and it's known to be false. Per capita economic growth in the so-called roaring 1990s in the United States was about the same as Europe, much lower than in the first 25 post-war years before what is called globalization. So we can ask how the conventional picture can be so radically different from uncontroversial facts, and they are uncontroversial. Well, the answer is very simple. For a small sector of the society, the 90s really were a grand economic boom. And that sector happened to include the people who tell everyone else the wonderful news. It's only the world that's different. There's a counterpart in India, which I don't have to talk about. It's familiar. Suppose we take a quick look at the record over a longer stretch. International economic integration, it's called globalization in a technical sense, that increased steadily up until the First World War, leveled or even reduced between the wars, picked up again after the Second World War. It's now reaching roughly the levels of a century ago by gross measures. Take a look at the fine structure, it's quite different. By some measures, the period before World War I had a higher degree of international integration. That had to do particularly with movement of people, what Adam Smith called the free circulation of labor, which was the foundation of free trade. That reached its peak before the World War I. It's much lower now. By other measures, globalization is greater now. Most dramatically, the flow of short-term speculative capital, which is far beyond any precedent. And these differences reflect the central features of the contemporary version of globalization. To an extent even beyond the norm, capital has priority. People are incidental. There is a more technical measure of globalization. That's convergence to a global market. It means a single price and wage everywhere. Well, that certainly hasn't happened. In fact, the opposite has happened. And with regard to incomes, inequality is soaring through the globalization period within countries and across countries, and that's expected to continue. The U.S. intelligence community, with participation of specialists from academic professions and the private sector, recently released an important report on their expectations for the next 15 years. And they have several scenarios. The most optimistic, which I'll quote, is that globalization proceeds on course. Its evolution will be rocky, marked by chronic financial volatility and a widening economic divide. That means less convergence, less globalization in the technical sense, but more globalization in the doctrinally preferred sense. And financial volatility, of course, means slower growth and more crises. Well, that gives a good sense of where the world is heading, at least if the masters of the universe can proceed without too much disruption by the rabble. I've already noted that military planners are adopting the same projections, and they explain forthrightly that the overwhelming resources of violence, which are to be space-based in the new era, will be required to keep the growing numbers of have-nots under control. It's too late to give details, but if you look at the post-war period since the Second World War, it's actually undergone two phases. There was a period up to the early 1970s when the Bretton Woods arrangements were in place with capital controls and regulated currencies, and that was a period of very substantial economic growth. It's commonly called a golden age of capitalism. That changed in the last 25 years with the breakdown of the Bretton Woods system. Financial markets were liberalized, constraints on capital flow were eliminated, and currencies were deregulated. That has been associated with a marked deterioration in standard measures of the economy, rate of growth of the economy, of productivity, of investment, in fact, even growth of trade. Even with all the misleading definitions of trade, its growth has declined during the globalization period, last 25 years. There have been much higher interest rates, which harm the economies, increasing financial volatility, and other harmful consequences. So let's return to that profound and troubling dilemma that we're supposed to be worried about. The rapid growth and great prosperity brought by so-called globalization has also brought global inequality because some lack the skills to use the opportunities. There's no dilemma because the rapid growth and prosperity are simply a myth, except for a very small sector. Now, one consequence, you can debate the effects of liberalization of capital, but one consequence of liberalization of capital is very clear. It undermines democracy. That was understood very well by the framers of the Bretton Woods Agreement after World War II, U.S. and Britain. One reason, explicit reason, why those arrangements were founded on regulation of capital was in order to allow governments to carry out social democratic programs, which had enormous popular support in the United States as well. Free capital movement yields what's called a virtual parliament, which has veto power over government decisions, sharply restricting democratic options. I'm quoting from technical papers on the financial system now. With free movements of capital, governments face a dual constituency. Voters and speculators. Speculators conduct moment-by-moment referendums on government policies, and if they don't like them, they veto them by attacking the current country's currency or removing its capital. Even in rich countries, the private constituency prevails. That's understood to be a very striking difference, maybe the most significant difference between the current phase of globalization and the period before World War I, which it partly resembles. That point is, I say, understood. I'll simply quote from a standard history of the contemporary, the International Monetary System, by Barry Eichengreen. Before World War I, he points out, government policy had not yet been politicized by universal male suffrage and the rise of trade unionism and parliamentary labor parties. Therefore, the severe costs of financial rectitude that were imposed by the virtual parliament could be transferred to the general population. It's what's called structural adjustment these days for the poor countries. But that luxury was no longer available in the more democratic Bretton Woods era. Therefore, limits on capital mobility substituted for limits of democracy as a source of insulation from market pressures. Now, he doesn't carry the argument further, but it's entirely natural that the dismantling of the post-war economic order should be accompanied by a sharp attack on substantive democracy, as it has been, primarily in the United States and Britain, the greatest enthusiasts, and of course in the Third World, which has no choices, or at least believes it has no choices. That's not so obvious. The attack on democracy is perhaps the most significant feature of the globalization period, often called a leaden age in comparison with the golden age that preceded it, just by straight economic measures. Other components of the neoliberal programs lead to the same ends. So socioeconomic decisions are increasingly shifted to unaccountable concentrations of power. It's an essential feature of the neoliberal reforms. There is a substantial extension of this attack on democracy. It's now being negotiated without public discussion in Geneva on the General Agreement for Trades and Services, the GATS negotiations, and it's coming up in Doha right now. The term services refers to just about anything that might fall within the arena of democratic choice. So health, education, welfare, social security, communications, water, other resources, anything involving that is services. Now, there's no meaningful sense in which transferring services to private hands is trade, but then the term trade has been so deprived of meaning that I suppose it might as well be extended to this travesty as well. That's simply a cover term for handing it over to private power. This term, trade and services, is in fact a euphemism for programs that are designed to undermine popular sovereignty and reduce the arena of democratic choice by transferring decisions over the most important aspects of life from the public arena to unaccountable private tyrannies. The huge public protests in Quebec last April at the Summit of the Americas were in part directed at the attempt to impose these GATS principles in secret as part of the new planned free trade area of the Americas. And they remained secret. The secret was guarded carefully by the self-censorship of the free press. These protests brought together a very broad constituency, unprecedented in fact, including the powerful labor unions and social democratic parties of South America, their counterparts in the North, and a great many others, all strongly opposed to what's being planned by trade ministers and corporate executives behind doors that are kept tight shut, and for good reasons. Actually, there's no time now to run through the details, but they're highly instructive. In the United States, there has been a transition from a golden age to a leaden age. For a large part of the population, incomes have stagnated or declined. That's probably 70% of the population during these 20 years of a fairy tale economy. The picture gets a lot worse if you move away from the standard measures and look at the actual costs. But again, there's no time for that. Well, it's easy to continue. Furthermore, the rules of the game, as they're formulated in the World Trade Organization, are likely to extend these effects. These rules, anyone familiar with economic history can see exactly what's going on. The rules of the World Trade Organization specifically bar the measures that were used by every rich country, England, the United States, Japan, the rest, to reach the current state of development. They also provide unprecedented levels of protectionism for the rich, including a patent regime that bars innovation and growth in novel ways and allows corporations to amass huge profits by monopolistic pricing of products that are often developed with a substantial public contribution. There's one, if the United States, let's say 200 years ago, had been forced to accept this regime, New England, where I live, would now be pursuing its comparative advantage in exporting fish. It certainly wouldn't be producing textiles, which survived only by exorbitant tariffs to keep out superior British products. Same with steel and other industries, and that goes right up to the present, including the extremely protectionist Reagan years. The relation of England to India is pretty much the same until India had finally been deindustrialized effectively by the combination of forced liberalism for the defeated and high levels of protection and a powerful state for the winners. And that runs across the world. Just take a look at the societies that have developed. Parts of Europe, England and its offshoots, the United States, Japan, a couple of countries in the Japanese periphery. They're the developed countries, and they happen to be exactly the countries that were able to resist colonialization and forced liberalism. The correlation is very striking and well known to economic historians, I should say. Well, I don't want to suggest that the prospects are uniformly bleak. We don't have to prove that the species is a biological error. There have been very promising developments in the past several decades. One of them is the evolution of a human rights culture among the general population. That's a tendency that has accelerated very quickly from the 1960s, when all the ferment of those years had a substantial civilizing effect in many domains. One significant feature has been greatly heightened concern for civil and human rights, including rights of minorities, rights of women, and rights of future generations. That's the driving force of the environmental movement that's become a significant force in the past several decades. The human development movement that was initiated by Amartya Sen and Mahbub al-Haq particularly, and to which the Lakdawala lectures that I gave are dedicated, is one manifestation of that. Over the course of modern history, if over a longer stretch, there have been very important gains in human rights and democratic control of at least some sectors of life. These have very rarely been the gift of enlightened leaders. They've typically been imposed on states and other power centers by popular struggle. And an optimist might hold, perhaps realistically, that history reveals a deepening of appreciation for human rights and a broadening of their range. Not without sharp reversals, but the tendencies nevertheless seem real. And these issues are very much alive today. The harmful effects of the corporate globalization project have led to mass popular protest and activism in the South for several decades now, joined by major sectors of the rich industrial societies in the past few years, with alliances that have been taking shape at grassroots levels. These are impressive developments. They have a lot of opportunity and promise, and they've had effects in the rhetorical and sometimes policy changes in the international financial institutions, the corporate world, and commentary generally. There has been at least a restraining influence on state violence, though nothing like the human rights revolution in state practice that's proudly proclaimed by intellectual opinion in the West. Well, these developments could prove very important if the momentum can be sustained in ways that deepen the bonds of sympathy and solidarity and interaction that have been developing. And I think it's fair to say that the future of our endangered species may be determined in no small measure by how these popular forces evolve. Thanks.
Yeah, now we'll, as I said, take some questions. We have one question from the organizers here. Perhaps we could kick off with this. Could you please go into the question of what explains the September 11 crisis, the likely September 11 crimes, the likely perpetrators and the reservoir of support? And finally, what are the policy options?
Well, who carried out the crimes? We know a number of them, the ones who killed themselves, so those are known. They were mostly middle-class, urban, educated people, mostly from Saudi Arabia. They certainly were not people who'd been hiding in caves in Afghanistan. The United States decided that the source is that you have to personalize these things so you can carry out a crusade. So they picked Osama bin Laden and the Taliban who have interacted with him, which could be true, but they have apparently no evidence for it. If there were any evidence, it would be presented. You could be sure of that, just simply to mobilize public support. The United States selected a increasingly comical client named Tony Blair to present the case to the world, sort of hiding in the background. I suppose the public relations purpose of that was to convey the image that we really have lots of secret information that this little boy doesn't know about, but so we'll let him do it. But whatever the purpose was, they basically have no information, pretty clearly. And that's not very surprising. I mean, I think it's not at all unlikely that these networks are indeed responsible. That was everybody's first assumption, mine too, and I think it's the plausible assumption. But there's a big difference between plausible assumptions and evidence. And networks like that are very hard to penetrate. They're decentralized, non-hierarchic, don't have much communication. They follow a policy that's actually called leaderless resistance. It's also used by Christian right terrorists in the United States, why the FBI can never penetrate those groups. Leaderless resistance means that there's a kind of a shared, point of view, maybe established by spokespersons, but then actions are carried out in small groups, maybe consistent with those policies, but probably without much communication. Anyone who's been involved in, say, anti-war activities or resistance activities knows exactly how this works, because that's always the way it's done. Just automatically, resistance activities are always, if they're serious, are going to be carried out with leaderless resistance, which is impenetrable. The FBI was never able to discover the people involved in the anti-war resistance in the United States, for example, not for lack of trying. These are just hard groups to penetrate. And so they probably won't be able to find evidence, although it's likely that that's roughly the range in which the perpetrators lie. And if anybody knows about this, it's the CIA, because they helped set them up. And they nurtured them for 10 years, not alone, together with British intelligence, Pakistan, Egypt, Saudi Arabia. They mobilized the best killers they could find from around the Muslim world, who happened to be radical Islamists, and they created a powerful mercenary army, not small, about 100,000 people maybe, armed them, trained them, gave them manuals, showed them how to carry out terrorist acts. Nurtured them for about 10 years, not in order to help the people of Afghanistan, on the contrary, help destroy the country. And then when they were done with them, they say goodbye. But these guys had their own agenda, and it was no secret. Remember, 20 years ago, 1981, they assassinated the president of Egypt, who was one of the most enthusiastic of their creators. In 1983, one suicide bomber, who may be connected to these networks, drove the U.S. military out of Lebanon. And right through the 80s, it continued. After 1990, it spread around the world. They tell you exactly what they're doing. It's not a big secret. And it's, within their framework, it's as rational as the framework that's leading to development of destruction of the world within the Western framework. Both frameworks are rational internally, maybe lunatic looked at from some other point of view, but internally rational, and we know what they are. So I presume those are the perpetrators, and they're doing it for exactly the reasons they say. to overthrow speaking from their point of view, you've all heard it, to overthrow the oppressive and brutal and corrupt regimes of the Arab Islamic world in general, to drive out the infidels, the foreigners who've invaded Muslim lands, and to protect Muslims everywhere from attack. Okay, that's it. Let me say it pretty straight. They've been saying it for 20 years. That's the likely perpetrators. They do draw on a reservoir of support. The support may come from people who despise them, like, in fact, they're targets. You know, rich Muslims in the Arab world are their targets, but they still resonate to their message. They too are opposed to the corrupt and brutal and oppressive regimes in the Arab world. There's even those who are, very strongly supportive of the United States and closely linked to it, despise the United States because of its support for these corrupt regimes, its undermining of any steps towards democracy, and its, in fact, blocking of independent economic development. And they say so. You can read, to its credit, the Wall Street Journal, main business journal, after September 11th, began looking at this question and had some good studies of the opinions of what they call moneyed Muslims, rich Muslims, bankers, international lawyers, and those people. This is what they say. And that's on the streets. It's much harsher, of course. But basically what they say, and they also point to specific policies. The policy of devastating the civilian society of Iraq while strengthening Saddam Hussein, and although the West prefers to forget it, it supported Saddam Hussein right through his worst atrocities, including the gassing of the Kurds and all the rest. And that they remember, and when bin Laden says that, they remember what it means. So he's being strengthened, the civilian society is being destroyed, and a little bit to the south, the U.S. alone has been maintaining the harsh and brutal Israeli occupation in the occupied territories, now going into its 35th year. Well, these things arouse enormous antagonism, and out of that comes a kind of a reservoir of support, even by those who despise the terrorism and its likely perpetrators. What are the policy options? Well, what are the options when a crime is committed? So, for example, let's take a much worse terrorist act, the U.S. attack on Nicaragua, far worse, practically destroyed the country. It wasn't an instant destruction. It was different in that respect, but over a couple of years, much worse. Nicaragua pursued the right policy options. It went to the International Court of Justice, presented evidence, which wasn't hard in that case. The court considered its case, considered the U.S. case, accepted Nicaragua's case, condemned the United States for international terrorism, it wasn't going to punish anybody, but it called on the United States to terminate the crime, to pay reparations. When the U.S. refused, Nicaragua went to the Security Council, which did try to pass a resolution calling on states to observe international law. That was vetoed. Nicaragua went to the General Assembly. They could get a unanimous vote practically, but it doesn't mean anything. And at that point, the options are finished for a law-abiding state. If the United States were to pursue those measures, nobody would stop it. In fact, there'd be universal applause. It's kind of striking that the U.S. could easily have gotten a Security Council resolution to legitimate even the crime, and they are major crimes in Afghanistan. I mean, the attack on Afghanistan is a major crime, in my opinion, far worse than September 11th. But the U.S. could have gotten authorization for that. I mean, it also happens to be illegal, but it could have been legal. Crimes can be carried out under authorization of law, unfortunately. The U.S. could easily have gotten Security Council support for ugly reasons. The 5 countries that have veto power would have supported the U.S. because they're all terrorist states, and they all support massive terrorism. They all want U.S. authorization for their own terrorist acts. Actually, India is similar, wants authorization for its own state terrorism. And that's true quite generally. That's true of Turkey and Algeria. Everybody in the coalition of the just joined it pretty much for this reason. So they could have gotten authorization, but they didn't want it. Because to get Security Council authorization, would imply that you need Security Council authorization. That is, that there is an authority to which you have to defer. And if you're seeking hegemony, you don't want that principle. You want to be able to act unilaterally without any authority. This is not Bush. This is traditional policy. Clinton said this is Clinton's first speech to the United Nations in 1993, said that we'll act multilaterally when it works, but if it doesn't, we'll act unilaterally in support of our own interests. And that's the way you should expect a great power to operate if it can get away with it. So they preferred to do it illegally. But there are options, and the options are hard to pursue. The option, I noticed in the newspapers this morning that India was very pleased that the United States is pressuring Pakistan to turn over accused criminal responsible for crimes in India, and they want Pakistan to indict him. Well, you know, they could probably have obtained the extradition of Osama bin Laden. We can't be sure, but the Taliban were making gestures in that direction. And the U.S. there's only one way to find out whether they were meaningful, and that is to pursue them. But they didn't want to do that because they might have been meaningful, and that would have been a problem. Because then what do you do with them after you've got them? You don't have evidence, you don't have a case, and so on. So, and besides, it opens dangerous directions. Same with the extradition request for Pakistan. If you begin to open that door, there are a lot of questions waiting right behind it. For example, the U.S. harbors major war criminals and refuses to extradite them. Much worse ones than the one in Pakistan. To mention just the obvious case, the government of Haiti, poorest country in the hemisphere for years, has been asking the United States to extradite Emmanuel Constant, who's a killer and a murderer, a leading figure, the leading figure in the paramilitary forces in Haiti that murdered 4,000 or 5,000 people in the mid-1990s with the tacit support of the Bush and Clinton administrations. That's not what you read in the newspapers, but in fact it's true. That he's been convicted in absentia in Haiti. They didn't have much trouble finding evidence, and now they want him returned. The U.S. refuses, presumably because it's afraid of what will happen if he stands up in open court and tells people about his connections with international terrorism, mainly the CIA, and they don't want that out. So he's not extradited. And when you begin, and there are other cases, when you begin pushing these questions, all sorts of unpleasant possibilities arise. But those are options. You know, those are options if you want to find the perpetrators of the crime and punish them. If you just want to show that you can slaughter a couple 100,000 people and get away with it and have everybody applaud in the West, well, you do it a different way.
Yes, the gentleman there. Kannan, if you can get the mic across to this gentleman. Where is the mic? As quickly as possible. Gentleman here.
Incidentally, let me just mention that this case of Emmanuel Constant has yet to be reported in the United States.
I think
it's been going on for years.
There we are, yes. Please identify yourself and ask. There, Mr. Kannan, there, the gentleman. Yes, thanks. As succinctly as possible.
Professor inquiry is specifically for what is happening in Afghanistan. United States has an economic interest in having political cleavage to ensure its oil resources in Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and other countries. But militarily speaking, they are bombarding places which have even no relevance whatsoever.
Which have
no relevance.
No relevance.
That is because if you look at the successive United States governments, it started with Korean War in 1950. It went on to Iraq, and finally to Kosovo, and now to Afghanistan. Is it that United States government is trying, is new armaments in these enlarged areas just to test them?
Thank you.
There is an oil interest. Anything that happens in that part of the world, oil is behind it. You know, like if this were the Antarctic or something, nobody would care what's going on. But these are the major sources of oil in the world, energy. Not Central Asia, but the Gulf. That's where most of the oil is. Central Asia is important, but secondary. So yeah, that's in the background. And there have been efforts by U.S. oil companies to push in a pipeline through Afghanistan from the Central Asian countries for some years. But that can't be the reason for what's going on, because those issues were always there, and they didn't decide to bomb Afghanistan. But in the background, you're right. Is the United States trying to test the countries? I really doubt it. You know, I mean, we don't have internal documents now to tell you what the planning is in Washington, but you can make a pretty good guess. It's probably the standard procedure. And there is a standard procedure, not just for the United States, but for anyone with substantial power. Criminal organizations work this way too, say the mafia. Suppose you're a mafia don, you know, and someone, you know, some storekeeper doesn't pay you protection money. Well, what do? You don't go to the court and get a court order and send the police to make him pay the money. That's the parallel to going to the Security Council to getting authorization. You don't do that. What you do is you send your goons in and you beat them to a pulp. You know, and the purpose is to establish what's called credibility. Actually, that's the term that's used in the international affairs literature, and it's the term that governments use. They say, if, for example, the bombing of Serbia, the main purpose, you know, intellectuals have to make up stories that make it look good. That's their job. But the governments were pretty straight about it. Britain and the United States particularly. They said we have to maintain the credibility of NATO. NATO doesn't mean NATO. You know, nobody cared about the credibility of Belgium, for example. What it means is the credibility of the United States and its attack dog. Those are the two states whose credibility has to be maintained, and credibility means just what it means for a mafia don. Everyone has to be frightened. That's the meaning of those statements I was reading from the major planning document called Essentials for Post-War Deterrence. Our national persona must be irrational and vindictive. Otherwise, people might not be afraid enough to do what we tell them to do. And you can regularly have to demonstrate this. I presume that that's the background thinking in this case too, and it's perfectly reasonable. You know, I'm not suggesting there's anything unreasonable about it. It's reasonable for the mafia don, it's reasonable for world leaders, it's reasonable for respectable intellectuals to make up stories about how marvelous our leaders are and committed to benevolence and so on and so forth. All of that goes right back through history. They're practically, I don't even know of any exceptions to it, and we see it again in the present case. Now, again, this is speculation. We don't have internal documents in this case, but I'd be willing to wager that's what it is.
Is there anyone up there before we... and do you have a mic? Balasundaram there has a mic for... Yeah, but do you have the mic? Yes, please. Please identify yourself and ask.
My name is Vikram. Professor Chomsky, one question. You have presented a very good overview of the state looking outside from the US. How do you see, can you hear me now? How do you see current laws being passed in the US, the SCAA, the USA Act, the Patriot Act, and currently the revocation of confidential communication even between a lawyer and the client? How do you see the curtailment of civil liberties in the US against the backdrop of US looking outside at the world for enemies and I mean, somebody to pin it on?
Thank you.
Personally, my feeling is that measures of that kind are much more dangerous in India than they are in the United States. The Prevention of Terrorism Ordinance, which is the Indian counterpart. The reason is that in India, this is handing over power to violent, repressive apparatus, which uses it directly, you know, and this gives them more power. It's the last thing India needs. The United States is just different for lots of reasons, including a couple hundred years of having smashed everybody in the face. One result of that is that internally it's a pretty free society. And there's a lot of protection of civil liberties that doesn't come from the government, it comes from the population. It's a deeply rooted tradition by now, and they're not going to give it up. Furthermore, civil liberties are protected by the rich and the powerful because they benefit from them. They do not want the state to be powerful enough to carry out actions against citizens that could harm them. They want a compliant state, not a powerful state. So a more developed form of state capitalism will tend to have civil libertarian protections. And they have these like freedom of speech, which is very well protected in the United States by comparative standards. That's not a gift. It's not in the Constitution. It's not in the Bill of Rights, contrary to what they may teach you in school. It doesn't say anything about freedom of speech. Those were rights that were won by giving meaning to the First Amendment through struggle. In fact, it was pretty recent. It wasn't until the 1960s that the United States crossed the Maine barrier, which has not been passed by any other country, to my knowledge, and eliminated, the courts were eliminated, the Supreme Court eliminated the rule of the law of seditious libel, the law that says that you can't assault the state in words, even if what you say is true. You can't defame state authority, seditious libel. As far as I know, every other country still has those restrictions, including England. But they were overcome finally in the United States in 1964, and that was in the course of the Civil Rights Movement. And it grew out of the Civil Rights protest. That's the way these rights are established, and they're pretty firmly rooted. There'll be an attempt to undermine them, you're right. But frankly, I don't think it's going to get very far.
No, please. I think we'll have to regulate these questions. I'm sorry.
Hello, sir. Please.
The question we are going to raise now, please, is one of the written questions. We have a lot here. After that, we'll take you. This is from Mr. Peter Alphonse. I assume it's the Member of Parliament and leader of the Tamil Nadu Manila Congress, whose question is, why does religion play a major role in the 21st century terrorism? How do you counter and combat globalization of Islam, a potential security threat to Asian countries, non-Islamic like India? What is your suggestion for India in the present war?
Well, my impression is that India, the non-Islamic part of India, has its own forms of extreme religious fanaticism. The United States is a major fundamentalist country. That's no joke. I mean, if you really look at it, the fundamentalist Christian movements in the United States surpass anything I know, and certainly in the developed world. I mean, for example, 40% of the population in the United States believe that the world was created 6,000 years ago. Around 85% believe in miracles or have even seen them. And there are a lot of other beliefs. About half the population thinks that there are extraterrestrials among us, aliens. Islamic fundamentalism is not unique in the world. I mean, there are lots of things developing. Where did Islamic fundamentalism come from? It's a little odd to talk about Islamic fundamentalism being a problem to India as if it's in isolation, as if, say, Hindu fundamentalism is not a problem to India. It surely is. But I agree with you, it is a problem. But we ask where these things came from. It's not too obscure. They come from the denial of opportunity. They come from the denial of opportunity for meaningful political participation. Take a close look in case after case. Algeria, Egypt, Kashmir, close by. You look at other places where people are denied the opportunity to act in a meaningful way in the political arena. They find other ways to do it. I suspect that's part of the reason for the rise of extreme fundamentalism in the United States. Political options have indeed been restricted, not by force, but by other measures like neoliberal programs, which diminish opportunities. And people want to identify themselves in some way. They want to press their interests in some way. If political participation is blocked, they'll find other ways. These ways often turn into religious fundamentalism or other forms of fanaticism. That's only one of the forms. And it can be very dangerous. I agree with you on that. How do you deal with it? By dealing with the causes. You want to deal with these things.
One question, please.
No, please
Professor
wait for him
Mahmood.
to finish. Who's this?
Okay.
Please. Yes.
The causes, and just to finish, the causes, nothing's that simple, but the primary cause in this case is very clear. It is the diminishing and the reduction or elimination of means of participation in determining your own fate through some sort of a democratic system. If that's blocked, other things will develop. History of Kashmir shows it very dramatically.
Yes, the gentleman here who's been waiting for a while after. Yes.
Sir?
Yes, sir. Just like two questions.
Okay, sir. Identify yourself.
Please identify yourself.
Yes, sir. I'm Karthik Ramanathan. I'm a student, and so just two quick questions now. And we often read in the papers of this Diego Garcia base in the Indian Ocean. So proudly, the Indian media displays it that American troops are sending their forces into whatever place to bomb Afghanistan. And what they don't write is things like the fact that the American forces, the Diego Garcia base, they're situated less than 500 miles. I'm not sure about the number because the media never talks about it, but they're situated less than 500 miles from Indian territory, the Lakshadweep Islands. And nobody just seems to know about it. Nobody even knows what Diego Garcia is. And all the mainstream political parties,
Question, please.
They all. My question is simple. Why is this media complacency to media and political complacency towards the presence of American troops? Why do we take no threat from them? Would America tolerate Indian or some troop situated 500 miles from their coast? Nobody seems to be asking that question. Why is that? And the second question is, the American, despite all their CIA intelligence and everything and all their so-called technology, they have prevented one single person from planting a bomb or ramming a jet into their building. Can they really dominate? Whatever technology they develop, can they really dominate the world?
Can they dominate?
Right, thank you.
Yeah, I understood that part. So the first part is about Diego Garcia. That's, just a straight power play. The United States wanted the island as a military base. It wanted it as part of the great system of intervention aimed at the Gulf energy resources. The main U.S. intervention forces, called the Central Command, have been aimed right at the oil-producing areas for many years. It doesn't have anything to do with the Russians or anybody else. That's incidentally conceded now with the collapse of the Russians. It was officially conceded that they had nothing to do with it. It had to do with the fear of independent nationalism, which might lead to movements that would take over the resources of the region for the benefit of its own population. And that's intolerable, of course. The prime beneficiaries of those resources have to be rich Westerners, the United States, Britain, energy corporations, and so on. And as long as governments are in place which accept that rule, say the Saudi Arabian government, they'll be accepted. But if they aren't, they're going to be overthrown. So Diego Garcia is part of it. It extends from Guam in the Pacific all the way over to the Azores in the Atlantic. And it goes right through the Indian Ocean, and Diego Garcia is a base. Well, okay, it was a British island, so the British kicked out the population, and the United States took it over and turned it into a military base. I mean, as you know, I'm sure, the population has been pursuing the case through the British courts, and they won. You know, the High Court in England accepted their case and said that the British government, which technically still owns it, has to bring them back. The United States just said, get lost, you know, and Britain got lost. It's kind of like the World Court case. So yeah, they stay there. But that's just plain exercise of force. If anyone knew about it, nobody knows about it in the United States. I mean, you do a database search in the press, I doubt if it's been mentioned twice in the last 20 years. So no one knows. Nobody knows about the dispossessed population or anything that's happened, and therefore there's no protest. You know, you can't protest something you don't know about. That's part of the duty of the free press and the intellectual community, make sure people don't know about things that might lead them to protest. If people knew, they would do something about it, and the forces would have to get off the island. The people could get back home. Does the United States have the technical means to protect the country from attack? No, it doesn't. As I mentioned, I was quoting a high-level technical study by an agency close to the government, which said that the probability, which I quoted it, that you'd have 90% success if you tried to bring a small plutonium bomb into the United States. I mean, the borders are permeable. You can't control the U.S.-Canadian border. People can find a way to climb across through the forests. If they can do it over the Himalayas, they can do it across the Canadian border. And there's no way to stop that. And there never will be a way. But as I mentioned, protecting the security or even the survival of the country has never been a high priority. If it were a high priority, they would have blocked intercontinental ballistic missiles 50 years ago. They would have accepted Khrushchev's offers and all sorts of other things. And that's not unique to the United States. You take a look at world history, countries do start wars, and they often end up destroyed. They're doing it for other reasons, even if they face destruction. There are institutional reasons for that. They're not nice ones, but they're there. So yes, they can't protect themselves, and it's not a significant issue. The 40,000 or so loose nuclear weapons in the Soviet Union are a much greater threat, and they're doing very little about that, because it ranks too low in the scale of values as compared with establishing credibility and hegemony and so on.
And, someone up there who has the mic, yes.
We have a question. Yes.
Please identify yourself. Yes.
One, sir. I'm Professor Mahmood.
Yes, carry on.
I'm Professor Mahmood. I was on a teaching assignment 25 years ago in Afghanistan. I had made some observations. So I want to know, Afghanistan is a very poor country. Even for a strive for bread, is it worthwhile to attack Afghanistan? And second question, the $10 tents are attacked by the missiles of...
Let me get a translation. Yeah.
It's a very poor country.
Yeah.
Yes, second part of your question, yes. What's the second part?
Is it worthwhile to attack the $10 tents with $1 million missiles to use their arsenals, and produce their economy, American economy, boost the economy of America? And another question, where is the world it is heading? It is precisely, please give the answer, sir.
Right. Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, I think your observation is correct, but you're drawing the wrong conclusion from it. Afghanistan is worth attacking precisely because it is a poor, defenseless country. I mean, you don't want to attack somebody who can shoot back. That would be ridiculous, I mean, think of the Mafia Don again. I mean, is he going to attack another Mafia Don who can send goons in to kill him? I mean, you fight, if you have a choice, you fight against defenseless enemies. Then you can stand up on television and, make heroic gestures and so on and so forth without any concern. So yes, it's a very poor country. It's totally defenseless. Therefore, it's a fine punching bag. Take, say, the U.S. attacks against Libya right through the 1980s. I mean, why'd they attack Libya all the time? Beginning right away. I mean, as soon as the Reagan administration came in and started attacking Libya, bombed it, all sorts of things. Well, several reasons. First of all, Libya is defenseless, can't do a thing about it. Secondly, it's unpopular, so Gaddafi is not going to get any support from anyone, so therefore it's a perfect punching bag. Yeah, makes good sense. You want to establish credibility, that's the way you do it. Does it make sense to use, expensive missiles to attack a tent? Yeah, not a bad idea. I mean, it's in fact, I didn't mention this, but barely mentioned it, but the fact of the matter is that the military system has been a kind of a cover for economic development. It's not just weapons producers. It's not the military-industrial complex. That's a misleading term. The military provides a framework within which economic development takes place. That goes far back in history. Britain, the United States, Germany, and others developed their economies to a significant extent within the military system. So you go back a century ago, one of the hardest problems of mechanical and electrical engineering, really at the advanced frontier, was trying to figure out how to put a huge gun emplacement on a moving platform and make it possible for it to hit a moving target. That's naval naval guns. That was one of the hardest problems of the period. And trying to solve that problem, notice those problems you can solve at public expense. Private corporations don't have to take a chance on that. You do it at public expense under the framework of security. Public pays the costs, takes the risks. If anything works out, as it did, you hand it over to private corporations for profit. That's called free enterprise. And the whole American system of mass production developed that way. It was mostly worked out in the Army ordnance system for decades before it was handed over to private hands. Since the Second World War, this is the core of the dynamism of the economy. Virtually the whole high-tech economy comes straight out of the state sector. That's true of computers, the internet, lasers, automation, in fact, virtually all electronics. Over the past years, government spending has shifted from the Pentagon system, that's the Pentagon, Department of Energy, NASA, a number of agencies. It's shifted from them over to the National Institute of Health, Center for Disease Control, and others. The reason is the cutting edge of the economy is shifting to the biology-based sciences. So therefore, the public has to pay the costs of development there and take the risks if nothing works. And if it turns out okay, you hand it over to some pharmaceutical company who charges, exorbitant profits because they claim they need it for research and development, which is mostly done by the public anyway. But so using a missile to hit a tent, there's nothing wrong with that. It's just like building a joint strike fighter. Who are they going to fight? The United States outspends in military expenditures. It already outspends the next 15 countries in the world put together. They don't need a joint strike fighter for that purpose. But it's a spur to economic development. We wouldn't have a commercial aviation industry if it wasn't for the Air Force. The commercial aviation industry is largely a spin-off from air forces. Same with aerospace. And the same with quite a large part of the economy. So this isn't, it's not it's kind of irrational from another point of view, but in terms of the way a state capitalist economy can proceed with socializing cost and privatizing profit, this makes perfect sense. And an occasional display against a defenseless enemy is fine.
Now, the lady there, please.
No,
yes.
Please wait, you'll get a chance.
Yes,
Professor Chomsky.
please. Yes, carry on. It's working. Just speak into it, yes.
Professor Chomsky.
Identify yourself, please.
Radha Rajan from Vigil Public Opinion Forum. It's the fashion among the professional dissenters in India to equate Hindu fundamentalism with Islamic and Christian fundamentalism. I think semantically it is not right. You cannot have a Hindu fundamentalist, you may have a Hindu extremist. But
you can have a what?
You may have a Hindu extremist.
Extreme, yeah?
Yes. A Hindu fundamentalist is not in the same category. Now, I wonder if somebody has ever tried to ask himself, what is the reason for Hindu extremism in India today? And how old is Islamic fundamentalism in India? Secondly, when people campaign for the voice of the people of Kashmir, why is it that they don't want to talk about the voice of the people of Jammu and Ladakh who have been victims of Kashmiri oppression?
Thank you.
Well, these are questions that you have to answer, and they're not for me to answer. But you know way more about them than. Pardon? Published? Comment. Well, what I commented on. Look, if you say Hindu extremism is not fundamentalism, I agree. But Islamic fundamentalism is extremism, and it is not fundamentalism. And the same is true of Christian fundamentalism. The term fundamentalism is misused. I agree with you. Across the board, it's misused. It's a form of religious extremism. It doesn't have much to do with technical fundamentalism, going back to the literal principles of the holy texts. That's another thing. So yes, it's misnamed fundamentalism, and that's true of Islamic fundamentalism too. It's misnamed. In fact, when I write about it, I call it radical Islam, not Islamic fundamentalism, because that is an inappropriate term, and I assume it's also an inappropriate term for Hindu fundamentalism and also for Christian fundamentalism. It's a term is used loosely. You're right about that. As to the specific reasons for the origins of it, It'd be ridiculous for me to comment in this audience. You know much more about it than I do. And the same with the problems in Jammu and Kashmir and Ladakh. Those are your problems, not mine.
Yes, the gentleman here, yes. Will you give him the mic here, please? This gentleman up here in front, Sridhar? No, not you, the gentleman in front, yes. Just a minute, just a minute, you'll get the mic here. Can we give the mic here, please?
Mr. Chomsky, can I talk?
No, we're not taking that question. We'll take a question from this gentleman, please.
I suspect you're going to have
Yes.
to translate this one.
Go ahead, please.
Professor, dear Professor, I am Subramaniam, ex-Indian Army officer. The day the intelligentsia starts marketing their products faster than the arms dealers, perhaps the world could have less of these problems. Will you please do it for the world? Thank you.
If intelligence markets their processes faster than the military. Well, you know, I am much more skeptical about the intelligentsia than you are. I mean, my view is that if you look over history, intellectuals have been a very dangerous force. We have to be careful here. If we mean the intellectuals who are called respectable intellectuals or responsible intellectuals, the ones who are accepted within a society and honored within that society, they are typically the flatterers at the court. You know, now, that goes on right through history, back to the ancient texts. I don't know if it's true of the Sanskrit text, but it's certainly true of the Old Testament. I mean, take, say, the Old Testament. There was a category of intellectuals, and call them intellectuals, but that's what they were. There's an obscure Hebrew word that is translated in the West as prophet. It doesn't have anything to do with prophets. The people who were prophets were intellectuals. They were doing geopolitical analysis and giving moral lessons and so on. And there were two categories of them. There were the true prophets and the false prophets. But those designations were given many centuries after the event. At the time, the false prophets, the flatterers at the court, were honored. The people who centuries later were called true prophets, they were jailed, driven into the desert, you know, all sorts of things. And that's the way history works. So yeah, the intellectuals market their product, which is service to power, and they do it very effectively. There's always a periphery of dissidents, and if they don't have anything to market, really. If they're serious, they want to provide services to activist, popular organizations that try to do something. It's nothing to market, you know, you just try to participate.
I'll have to take a question from the written ones I have here, quite a few. This is from Sadanand Menon, a cultural critic and writer. In the context of the French repression in Algeria, Jean-Paul Sartre had remarked, quote, "So much torture, bloodshed, deceit. You cannot make your young people practice torture 24 hours a day and not expect to pay a price for it. My dear countrymen, France was once the name of a country. Take care that, in our times, it does not become the name of a nervous disease." That's unquote. And the question is, now we are worried about America. So much violence and skullduggery from its dirty tricks department. Can America ever be rescued from itself? Or is it destined to self-destruct as a rogue state?
Well, let's take France. The French, Sartre was one of the exceptions, but in fact, there was very little protest against what the French were doing in Algeria. Very little. And there was virtually no protest over what they'd been doing in Indochina right before that. There was no anti-war movement against the French effort to reconquer Indochina. When Algeria came along, most of the French intellectuals supported it. When they finally began to protest, it was very mild. This was like signing a petition against torture. There was very little active resistance against the French massacres in Algeria, which is part of the reason that they've been kept secret. You know, now they're beginning to leak out, but mostly they're not known because nobody was pursuing them. And there was the French Communist Party, for example, was trying to keep people quiet. People who wanted to support the FLN in Algeria had to leave it, and act individually. And furthermore, that continues until the present. There are lots of atrocities going on in Algeria. They are, for the most part, publicly, they're attributed to Islamic fundamentalists, radical Islamists. And to some extent, that's probably true. But there's very strong evidence that the core of those activities, those atrocities, are carried out by the state, often under the pretense that they're carried out by Islamic fundamentalists. I can tell you, if you're interested, that there's a major book about this written by Algerian dissidents, scientists, physicists, and others. I wrote the introduction to it. One of them is a person I know from MIT. And they did a very close analysis of the major atrocities in Algeria through the 1990s. Careful, detailed analysis of the kind that good scientists would do, and the conclusions are pretty striking. I mean, the typical atrocity is a kind of an all-day massacre carried out by people dressed up to look like Islamic fundamentalists, but taking place, 200 meters from a big army base where nobody pays any attention. And then after everyone's murdered, and a couple of months later, a general buys the property cheaply and builds a hotel. I mean, that's been the typical massacre. For example, the oil installations have never been subject to these actions. Now, the chances are pretty strong that French intelligence is involved in this. Like other imperial countries, including England and Portugal and Belgium and the rest of them, they were forced to decolonize, but they tried to maintain control. And one of the ways of maintaining control is through elite connections, including intelligence connections. So the lack of protest in France, and it was very low, over things like the Algerian atrocities, that has a cost to France and to Algeria and to all of North and West Africa, namely continuation of similar actions. Well, the United States is much more powerful, but fundamentally different, but not fundamentally different. So yes, there's that cost.
We'll take a question from up there. Who has the mic? Yeah, please speak up.
Professor Chomsky,
yes.
My name is Murali. So your criticism of the West has been lapped up by the audience, but what is your viewpoint on Kashmir? Do you think it is a movement for national self-determination? My question is that.
Thank you.
Yep. What's my view on Kashmir? Well, I don't like to talk about things I don't know very much about. You know more about it than I do. But if you want my opinion, it's this. There is a problem of self-determination in Kashmir, very serious problem. What does the population want? Okay, that's a problem. Maybe that's not the only issue. I'm sure it's not, but it's an issue. One issue is, what does the population want? That's why there were UN resolutions calling for a referendum way back. All right, India rejected them. That's a guarantee that there's going to be trouble. It's a virtual guarantee that there's going to be trouble. If you look over the years, this much better than I do, there was a time, there were efforts to develop some kind of autonomy, some independent, various moves were made. Finally, it led to the establishment of a political party calling for, not very clear what, maybe autonomy, maybe independence, wasn't too clear. There was an election, I think it was 1987, which was simply stolen. India would not allow the election to go through, and it rammed through a fake outcome in which the autonomy independence parties were just blocked. And after that came terrorism. What's the solution to this? Well, one part of the solution should be allowing a political expression to the population itself. That's part of a solution. Where that goes from there, how that interacts with other demands is not obvious. Some kind of autonomy within a maybe co-determined framework could be a possibility. The world allows things like that.
We'll have the lady here, please. Question, yes, the red sari. Can we get the mic to her? Yeah. And I'm sorry, this will be the last question.
Here, top.
This will be the last question. Obviously, there are far more questions than we can handle.
Please give the last question to the upstairs.
No, that's over. This is the very last question for the evening.
The last question.
Sorry, no. We're taking a question from the lady here, please.
I'm Parvati Sundaresan. Thank you very much. You have stoked the fires of our frustration and anger about what is happening around in the world. Now, today, I'm sure Mr. Shashikumar and Mr. Ram would have seen in the Hindu, in a boxed, big letter item, Clinton's remarks. He says, we are getting back what we have done. He mentioned about 200 years back what happened in America, driving out all the red Americans, etc. And the original Christian crusaders, how they burned down the Jewish synagogue and also attacked every Muslim woman and child in the Middle East and all. So we are getting back, this is his words. Now, isn't it ironical? He started the war against Iraq and as you mentioned in Sudan, and it was as you suggested, I mean, as you rightly put it, the facts never came out. What do you think about this? Second, what is your reaction to these remarks? And I saw it in the papers. Second thing, yesterday all of you would have watched Atal Bihari Vajpayee, our Prime Minister.
Can we stop with one question because?
Okay, sure. This is very relevant because
Okay, right. Thank you.
Okay, sure. Okay.
Well,
Thank you.
I didn't see Clinton's full remarks. I only saw what was reported in the Indian press, which was very tepid, and it totally avoided his own crimes, or in fact any recent crimes. I mean, it's true that Clinton could say, 200 years ago we didn't act very nicely. That's, something, but it's not much. If you go back to, say, 1840, it's a long time ago, President John Quincy Adams, former President John Quincy Adams, after he was out of office, like Clinton, spoke in much harsher terms. He condemned the fact that we are, he talked about, let me see if I can remember the words, this hapless race of North Americans that we are exterminating with such felicity, are exterminating right in the middle of it. That's way stronger than Clinton, and that was in 1840, and that was right in the middle of the actions, and it's not alone. I mean, they knew what they were doing. They knew that they were exterminating the native population. And it was not totally suppressed. It was kind of justified. Actually, if you read de Tocqueville, his Democracy in America, famous Democracy in America, he actually describes, he was an eyewitness to the famous, infamous, I should say, expulsion of the Cherokees. It's about the third time they were expelled in what was called the Vale of Tears. And he describes how he's amazed to see how Americans can carry out this murderous expulsion of weeping women and dying children and so on, and do it with complete nobility of purpose and self-justification and admiration of their own righteousness. So if Clinton now happens to notice what was talked about 150 years ago, that's nice, but I'm not overwhelmed. I would be more interested if he had talked about the kind of things you mentioned. His crimes, which are substantial. Just something, look, the bombing of Sudan, which I mentioned, that's like a footnote. And that one footnote probably meant tens of thousands killed. He's regarded as a great peacemaker in the Middle East. That's just not true. He was responsible, what's called the peace process in the Israel-Palestine peace process, that's an effort to prevent a peaceful settlement. And Clinton continued with it. You look at his Camp David proposals last year, 2000. I don't think that a map was ever published in the United States, at least not that I saw, showing the form of those of the arrangements. And there's a good reason why a map wasn't published. If you published a map, you'd see that it's a call for Bantustans. Clinton's proposals fragmented the West Bank into at least 3, maybe 4 separated cantons, kept maintained under U.S.-Israeli control. Just to go on, you read about the atrocities carried out there. So, for example, just to pick one, helicopters are regularly used for political assassination and also for attacking civilian complexes. Why? Where the helicopters come from? Israel doesn't manufacture helicopters. It's a big military force, but they can't produce helicopters. So the United States provides them. Take a look more closely. The current intifada, the fighting, broke out on September 30th of 2000. In the next few days, U.S. helicopters flown by Israeli pilots attacked apartment complexes, killing and other civilian targets, killing dozens of people. That was part of a massive set of atrocities. There was no fire then. People were throwing stones under military occupation, but they weren't shooting. What did Clinton do about it? Well, on October 3rd, 2000, so like 2 days after this, he made a deal to send the biggest deal in a decade to send Israel advanced military helicopters. Okay, that was his contribution. What was the contribution of the free press? Well, it was to keep it secret. So it still hasn't been published in the United States, not because they don't know. They know, but they don't want the population to know that you, the taxpayer, are sending advanced helicopters to a country that's using them to attack civilian targets. A couple of weeks later, they started using them for political assassinations. Well, the U.S. makes kind of mild reprimands about the assassinations. On the other hand, it continues to send the helicopters. So Bush's one of his early acts when he came into office was to arrange for a new shipment of the most advanced attack helicopters in the U.S. arsenal. Now that's because, as he says on television, there's a universal law, murder is bad, except when we provide attack helicopters for you to commit murder with them because we want you to do it. That was barely reported. I mean, if you look in the business pages, you'll find some item about how Boeing has a new contract sending attack helicopters to Israel, which is using them for political assassination and for attacks on civilians. A couple of weeks later, Israel started using F-16s, jet planes, to attack civilians. Within a week, the Bush administration had made a new deal to send them more F-16s. And it's not just Israel. I mean, same with Turkey. Like Turkey was carrying out some of the worst atrocities of the 1990s. Massive against Kurds, its own Kurdish population. Massive ethnic cleansing, 2 to 3 million refugees, killed tens of thousands of people, destroyed about 3,500 villages, 7 times Kosovo under NATO bombing. Where were they getting the arms from? From Bill Clinton. In fact, the arms continued to increase as the atrocities increased. Major atrocities. These are some of the worst atrocities of the late 1990s. They can go on. If Clinton wanted to talk about atrocities, he doesn't have to talk about something that happened 200 years ago, which was talked about more strongly then. He can talk about decisions that he made, and give the reasons for them. The way John Quincy Adams did. He was talking about his own crimes.
Thank you. That's about all the questions we can take. I now request Maithili Shivaraman, National Vice President of IDWA, All India Democratic Women's Association, to propose a vote of thanks.
Professor Chomsky, Carol Chomsky, Ram, Sashi Kumar, and friends. It's a great honor to have this opportunity to thank all of you on behalf of the 22 organizations who have been privileged to be associated with this historic assembly of citizens who have come to listen to Professor Chomsky and to interact with him. Professor Chomsky, we are deeply indebted to you for articulating the voice of reason, the voice of humanity, and the voice of civilized thinking. Mrs. Carol Chomsky, we thank you also for being with us this evening. It's been a great pleasure. We would like to thank N. Ram of Frontline and Sashi Kumar from the Asian School of Journalism for making this evening come true for all of us. Ever since everyone heard about the possibility of Professor Chomsky's visit, we've been dreaming of this evening, and we are very grateful to you for making this true for us. Thank you very much, Ram and Sashi Kumar. I would also like to thank Mr. Kamal and his team from the Asian College of Journalism for the acoustics and for the technical arrangements made to record the proceedings in time on audio and video. Those who wish to procure copies, please get in touch with the Asian College of Journalism. We thank Sadanand Menon for the stage setting and lighting, Radhika Menon and Tulika for the design and printing of the posters and the invitations to this event. The Hindu for the series of advertisements it ran in the newspaper announcing the public lecture. The media in Chennai, print, broadcast, and online media for the interest and support they have shown in their coverage leading up to this evening and being present in such solid strength here to cover the lecture. In this connection, we would like to make particular mention of Sun News, which telecast promotional spots on this function on the channel. We'd like to thank the Music Academy, particularly its president, Mr. T.T. Vasu, and their staff for kindly making this auditorium available to us. Finally, the wonderful audience who have turned up in such overwhelming numbers, not only from Chennai, but also from other parts of the country. We thank you very much for your patience, because many of you had to stand outside, inside, many of you didn't have seats, and still there was pin drop silence, and we thank you so much for your cooperation. And we were just thinking that but for the transport workers' strike, the crowd, the audience here would have been really unmanageable. We would have had a tremendous crowd. And volunteers from all the sponsoring organizations, whose names I'm going to read out in a minute. I'd like to thank the volunteers who have been running around doing a lot of things, and thank you so much. And now, if I may just take a minute to read out the names of the 22 organizations that are sponsoring this. The Indian School of Social Sciences, Chennai, Campaign Committee Against Nuclear Weapons, Movement Against Nuclear Weapons, People's Governance Cell, Tamil Nadu Science Forum, Tamil Nadu Progressive Writers Association, Democratic Youth Federation of India, All India Youth Federation, Students Federation of India, All India Students Federation, All India Lawyers Union, All India Bank Officers Confederation, Tamil Nadu Unit, All India Insurance Employees Association, Bank Employees Federation of India, Tamil Nadu Postgraduate Teachers Association, Tamil Nadu Government Employees Association, Indian Oil Employees Union, Confederation of Central Government Employees and Workers Tamil Nadu Unit, Federation of Medical and Sales Representatives Association of India, All India Democratic Women's Association, DAWN, and Indian Scientists Against Nuclear Weapons. Thank you, Professor Chomsky, once again, and thanks all of you.
Thanks, Michael.